Hi everyone, welcome to this tutorial on digital audio. In the last tutorial on analog audio, we discussed some of the basic characteristics of the process of analog recording. We mentioned some of those characteristics were that with analog you got a colored sound, and this colored sound came from distortion from the actual recording process. Now, distortion also comes not only from the tape machine, but we also got distortion from the mic preamps and everywhere else along the basic analog path that we discussed in prior tutorials. So that distortion helps to color the sound and give it its warmth that we discussed. Remember, we gave you the image, or we talked about the images in a film like The Sound of Music or Wizard of Oz, where they would add Vaseline around a lens to distort the image, and when it's distorted it tends to look softer, more inviting. Okay, that warmth that we get in an image also can translate into sound. When we add distortion, a slight amount of distortion, to an audio signal, we are also essentially adding warmth to that signal. Okay, so that was one of the characteristics of analog. We also talked about tape compression real quick. We talked about some of the other areas or characteristics of analog recording, degradation of signal. And we mentioned that most of that degradation comes from three sources: the usage, the fact that the tape degrades over time, and just the form of the tape. Those three things tend to add up to degradation of the audio signal on the analog tape over time. We also mentioned that analog was a linear process. In other words, to get from one location on the tape to another location, the only way you can get there is to scroll through or fast forward or rewind through the tape. You have to go along the tape in a linear process to get from one location to another. So those are some of the characteristics that we discussed that appropriately describe analog recording. So now let's talk a little bit about digital recording and how some of its characteristics may differ from analog. The first thing is that digital recording is non-linear, so just the opposite of analog. Now, this can actually be a real positive, and the reason for that is if you're in a piece of music and you want to go from one location to another. Here I have a copy of Pro Tools open and a song that I'm working on, and I want to listen to the piece of music from the beginning. All I have to do is place the cursor where I want the music to play, and it automatically plays. So if I scroll to a later time in the music, I can just click on it and hit play, and immediately it starts at measure 25. Or maybe towards the end of the song. So you can see I'm jumping from one location to another. Now I'm at 18 seconds. Now I'm in 1 minute and 12 seconds. So this recording process is completely non-linear. I'm not following a piece of tape all the way through the piece of music. I'm able to select the location I want to go to and immediately go there. So that is one of the big advantages of digital. Another advantage of digital is that you can edit very rapidly. In analog, you actually had to use a razor and cut the audio. Say, for example, we wanted to take that one guitar sound and we wanted to place it a bunch of different places in the same piece. We could actually take and tell that piece of audio to play numerous times. Okay, so it's real easy to create multiple versions of the same edit and move them around. You get the idea. Okay, so editing in digital is much quicker and much faster. We talked about some of the characteristics of analog and how some bands, like, for example, the Foo Fighters' last project, they recorded on analog and then they dumped it to digital most likely so that they can do their final editing. And this gives you a great example of why that might be advantageous. So let's talk a little bit about the differences in the signal path between analog and digital. How are the signal paths different from analog to digital? Okay, if you remember in Module 2, we discussed the basic analog signal path, and we described the basic analog signal path as first a sound source. This is the sound waves hitting the microphone. This is the microphone. And then we had an XLR or microphone cable that went over here and we plugged into the back of our analog console. And we diagrammed out a basic channel strip. And you remember that one of the things that we did was mention all of the individual components that we needed. We had our mic preamp, we had our inserts, we had our sends, input and output, pan knob, and then down here, volume fader. And then we would exit this, and we would come over here to usually an amplifier and 2 speakers. So one question to ask would be, what's the difference between a live situation where you're reinforcing sound using a PA and a recording situation? The difference is you have to actually record the medium, right? You have to record the audio. So if we delete this last bit, one of the things that we're going to go to, if we're recording analog, would be our 2-inch tape machine, and then to an amp, and then 2 speakers. If we're recording digitally, there's a few components that are different. So let's say that's our analog recording up here. And now we're going to record digitally. So if we're recording digitally, we need a few things that are not contained in the basic analog signal path or in an analog recording. One of those things is called an ADC. So this is the ADC. There are also other nicknames that we use for them. A to D. And what that does is that essentially converts our audio signal from an analog signal into a digital representation of the exact same waveform. So if we have a waveform and we're going to record that waveform, it used to be that we'd record that waveform onto an analog piece of tape that would transfer it from an electrical signal into a magnetized signal. Okay, it would just magnetize the tape with the same signal. So this same signal is just going to be transferred electrically onto magnetic tape that also stores those electrical waves or impulses. Okay, now when we record digitally, we're not doing that. We're not storing the actual waveform. We are digitally representing that same waveform. And that's what the analog to digital converter does, is it converts the electrical waveform or electrical signal into a digital representation of that signal. And it does that with an analog to digital converter. Another nickname for that is also an analog or an A to D. So ADC or A to D, they're both the same things. Now, once we've captured it and turned it into digital, we are going to store it. And most likely that will be on a hard drive or some other digital storage device. A USB thumb drive, maybe you want to store it onto a DVD or a CD. Anything that'll record and store digital data, you could store this data onto. Now, when we play it back, are we just going to go straight from this hard drive direct to an amplifier? And the answer is no. We are not. We have to convert it back to an analog signal. So we need a digital to analog converter in order to do that. And then we can go to our amp and then to our speakers. So the difference between analog and digital recording, other than its characteristics, are that in digital recording, we are required to have analog to digital converter, and we're converting it to digital data, ones and zeros that are stored on a hard drive. And then to hear it back, we have to again convert it back from digital to analog so that we can then send it out to our amplifier and then send it to the speakers so it can be reproduced and create sound waves again that our ears can hear. Okay, so you may go, well, I've never really heard of analog to digital devices or digital to analog devices. I don't think I really have anything that utilizes those. And the answer is that you actually have a lot of devices that use D to A's, A to D's. One example is your phone. When we're speaking into our phone, we are speaking analog, right? When I'm speaking into my phone, I am recording data into my phone. Your teacher is an idiot. What process is going on behind the scenes then? Well, first of all, I am speaking from my mouth, creating sound waves that the microphone in the iPhone is picking up, and it is transducing it, turning it into an electrical signal that then goes to an analog to digital converter and converts it into a digital representation of my voice. And it stores it on a tiny drive or flash drive in here, or flash memory. And then when I want to play it back, your teacher is an idiot. It converts it back from digital to analog and creates an analog electrical waveform that then drives the speakers, the tiny speakers in my iPhone, moves airwaves that my ears can pick up and hear. Let me ask you a question about A to D's and D to A's. What kind of converter would a CD player have in it? Would it have A to D's, D to A's, or both? The answer is that it only has D to A's because you can't record onto a CD player. So it only has digital to analog converters. It converts the data from digital to analog so that we can power speakers and hear that data. So to effectively hear and record a piece of audio digitally, you need both an analog to digital converter to record it, and then a digital to analog converter to convert it back to analog and play it back on speakers. One of the things that is important to realize is that once we have converted our signal to digital, the degradation of the signal stops, because here we're converting it to digital. So there's no more coloration of the sound. Now, would your sound be colored up to this point? Yes, it would. Your microphone, your mic preamp, the inserts, the sends, all of these things, the electronics in this signal path are going to color the sound, add distortion, etc., because it's still an analog signal path all the way along this line until we get to our analog to digital converter. Once we get there, then the deterioration of the signal, or the distortion that we're adding to the signal, stops. Okay, that's it for this tutorial on digital recording. In the next tutorial, we'll discuss more about digital terminology, and we'll explain how the analog to digital converter actually transforms an analog signal into a digital representation of that same signal.